Eddie Cochran sat in the back seat of a Ford Consul, rain hammering against the windshield as the car tore through the English countryside at 70 miles per hour. Just hours before, he had been a rock and roll god on the stage at Bristol's Hippodrome, thousands of teenagers screaming his name as he played the final chords of his set. Now at 21 years old, he was just another young man clutching his orange Gretsch guitar case against his knee, watching the blur of hedgerows and stone walls disappear into the April darkness. The transformation was surreal. One moment, Eddie had been bathed in stage lights, his voice soaring over the ecstatic crowd as he promised to take them 3 steps to heaven. The next, he sat in exhausted silence beside his girlfriend, Sharon Sheely, her head resting against the rain-streaked window, while Jean Vincent chain-smoked nervously in the front seat. Their driver pushed the sedan harder through the night toward London, racing against time to catch the first flight back to America. The British tour had been everything Eddie had dreamed of: sold-out venues, screaming fans, and the kind of raw energy that reminded him why he had fallen in love with rock and roll in the first place. But something felt different about this night. Something that made the usually talkative performer unusually quiet as Chippenham. Wiltshire flashed past in the darkness. The rain grew heavier, the road more treacherous, and somewhere in the distance fate was preparing to intervene. At 11:50 p.m., the headlights suddenly illuminated a sharp curve ahead. The wet asphalt gleamed like black ice in the harsh beams as the driver fought to control the skidding sedan. Time slowed to a crawl, Sharon's scream piercing the air, Jean's hands gripping the dashboard, Eddie's guitar case flying across the back seat as the car spun violently off the road. Then came the sickening crunch of metal against an English lamppost, followed by a silence so complete it seemed to swallow the rain itself. In that instant, the voice that had electrified a generation was silenced forever. The boy who had promised to take rock and roll to heaven in just 3 steps had completed his journey far sooner than anyone could have imagined. Eddie Cochran would never see another sunrise, never record another song, never again stand before a crowd of teenagers and make them believe that rebellion and freedom were just a guitar chord away. The official reports would speak of excessive speed and driver fatigue, but as news of Eddie's death spread across the Atlantic in the hours that followed, a darker question began to emerge from the wreckage. Was this really just a tragic accident? Or had the pressures of fame, the relentless demands of the music industry, and the dangerous lifestyle of rock and roll's brightest stars finally claimed their ultimate price? As the world mourned the loss of its newest rebel hero, those who knew Eddie best couldn't shake the feeling that his death was somehow inevitable, written in the very songs that had made him immortal. He had sung about living fast and dying young, about taking 3 steps to heaven, about the restless energy of youth that could never be contained. Eddie Cochran had hinted at his own destiny in every note he played, every lyric he sang, every stage he conquered. But before fate stopped him cold on that rain-soaked road in Wiltshire, before the 3 steps to heaven became his final journey, we must return to Albert Lee, Minnesota, where a shy boy named Ray Edward Cochran first picked up a guitar and discovered he could summon lightning with his hands. Only by understanding how it all began can we truly comprehend how it all ended, and why Eddie Cochran's brief, brilliant flame continues to illuminate the path for every rock and roll dreamer who follows. The year was 1938, and America was still climbing out of the Great Depression when Eddie Cochran entered the world in the small railroad town of Albert Lee, Minnesota. His father, Frank Cochran, worked the railroad yards with calloused hands and an aching back, while his mother, Alice, kept house and raised their children with the kind of stern discipline that Depression-era families knew by necessity. The Cochrans were not wealthy, few were in those days, but they possessed something more valuable: the unshakable belief that hard work and talent could lift a person above their circumstances. Even as a small child, Eddie displayed an unusual sensitivity to sound. He would sit for hours by the family's old Philco radio, his young fingers unconsciously picking out rhythms on whatever surface was nearest, his eyes distant with concentration. When the family moved to Bell Gardens, California in 1949, 11-year-old Eddie encountered something that would change his life forever. The electric guitar. It wasn't love at first sight. It was something deeper, more primal. The moment Eddie wrapped his fingers around the neck of that first guitar, a borrowed acoustic from a neighbor, something clicked into place that had been waiting his entire young life to be awakened. Within months, he was playing with a fluency that astonished his family and friends. By age 14, he had formed his first band, the Cochrans, with his brothers, playing local venues and school dances with an intensity that seemed to burn from somewhere deep inside. But it was when Eddie first heard the wild, untamed sounds coming out of Memphis, the revolution being born in Sam Phillips's son's studio, that his true calling revealed itself. Elvis Presley's voice crackling through the radio speakers didn't just inspire Eddie. It ignited something that had been smoldering in his teenage heart. This was music that spoke to the restlessness of youth, the desire to break free from the suffocating expectations of adult society, the need to feel alive in a world that often felt numbingly predictable. Could anyone have predicted that this quiet, introspective teenager from a railroad family would one day stand alongside Elvis and Chuck Berry as one of the founding fathers of rock and roll? The signs were there for those who knew how to look, the way Eddie's eyes blazed when he played, the hours he spent alone in his room working out chord progressions that no one had thought to try before, the growing confidence in his voice as he began to write his own songs. By 1956, 18-year-old Eddie had caught the attention of Cy Waronker at Liberty Records, but success would not come easily. The music industry in the late 50s was still figuring out what to do with rock and roll, still uncertain whether this new sound was a genuine cultural revolution or merely a passing fad that would burn out as quickly as it had ignited. Eddie found himself caught between two worlds, the raw, emotional power that poured out of him when he played, and the commercial pressures of an industry that wanted to package rebellion into something safe and sellable. The early recording sessions were exercises in frustration. Producers tried to smooth out Eddie's rough edges, to make him more palatable to mainstream audiences, but something essential was lost in the translation. It wasn't until Eddie began to assert more creative control over his recordings that his true voice emerged. Not just as a vocalist, but as a sonic innovator who understood instinctively how to capture the raw energy of live performance in the sterile environment of the recording studio. His breakthrough came with Sittin' in the Balcony in 1957, but it was Summertime Blues, released a year later, that truly announced Eddie Cochran as a force to be reckoned with. The song was revolutionary not just for its rebellious lyrics, teenagers singing about dead-end jobs and authoritarian parents, but for its innovative production techniques. Eddie layered multiple guitar tracks, created percussive effects using the studio itself as an instrument, and delivered vocals that seemed to leap directly from the speakers into the listener's rebellious heart. Was the success they achieved truly worth all the pain they endured? For Eddie, success came with a price that few outside the music industry understood. The constant touring, the pressure to produce hit after hit, the strange isolation that came with fame, all of it took a toll on a young man who had never asked for anything more than the chance to play his music and be heard. The transformation was almost supernatural. One day, Eddie Cochran was a working-class kid from Bell Gardens playing weekend gigs at local teen clubs and dreaming of making it big. The next, he was standing in front of thousands of screaming fans, his image plastered across magazine covers, his voice echoing from jukeboxes and radio stations across the globe. Summertime Blues had done more than make him famous. It had made him the voice of a generation that was just beginning to find its own. The late 50s were intoxicating years for a young rock and roller. Television variety shows clamored for appearances, record executives lined up with contracts, and teenage girls fainted at the mere mention of his name. Eddie's performances on shows like Town Hall Party revealed a performer who seemed born for the stage, his orange Gretsch 6120 guitar gleaming under the studio lights, his voice carrying a confidence that belied his 20 years, his entire being radiating the kind of sexual energy that made parents nervous and teenagers wild with excitement. But success in the music industry of the 1950s was a double-edged sword, particularly for artists who refused to compromise their vision. Eddie found himself caught in a constant battle between artistic integrity and commercial expectations. Record executives wanted him to record more songs like Summertime Blues, but Eddie's restless creativity was already pushing him in new directions. He spent countless hours in the studio experimenting with overdubbing techniques, layering guitars to create walls of sound that were years ahead of their time. The financial rewards were substantial, but they came with strings attached. Constant touring meant months away from home, living out of suitcases, performing the same songs night after night in venues that ranged from legitimate concert halls to sleazy clubs where the audience was more interested in drinking than listening. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part, surrounded by people all the time, yet feeling fundamentally alone, unable to form genuine connections with anyone who wasn't part of the strange, insular world of show business. Eddie's relationship with Sharon Sheeley provided some respite from the loneliness. Sharon was a songwriter in her own right, one of the few women breaking into the male-dominated world of rock and roll composition. She understood the pressures Eddie faced because she faced them herself, and their relationship became a refuge from the constant demands of fame. But even love couldn't entirely shield Eddie from the darker aspects of his success. Behind all that glamour was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw. Those closest to Eddie began to notice changes in him as the pressures mounted. The easy smile became forced, the infectious laughter less frequent. He began to speak obsessively about death, about the feeling that his time was somehow limited, that he needed to accomplish everything he could before it was too late. The music industry of the late 50s was a ruthless machine that consumed young talent with frightening efficiency. For every Elvis or Chuck Berry who managed to sustain a career, there were dozens of would-be stars who burned out in spectacular fashion, victims of drugs, alcohol, or the simple inability to cope with the pressures of sudden fame. Eddie watched friends and contemporaries fall by the wayside, and the knowledge that success in rock and roll was often tragically brief began to weigh on his mind. The irony was not lost on those who knew Eddie well. The songs that had made him famous were celebrations of youthful rebellion and freedom, but fame itself had become a kind of prison. Every public appearance was choreographed, every interview scripted, every aspect of his image carefully managed by publicists and managers who saw him less as a human being than as a valuable commodity to be protected and exploited. Yet even as the pressures mounted, Eddie's creative output remained remarkably consistent. Songs like Come On Everybody and Somethin Else showcased his growing sophistication as both a performer and a producer, while tracks like 20 Flight Rock revealed his ability to channel pure rock and roll energy in ways that influenced everyone from Paul McCartney to The Who's Pete Townshend. The late 50s rock and roll scene was a small, tight-knit community, and Eddie's reputation among his peers was perhaps more important to him than his commercial success. Musicians respected his technical innovations, his willingness to push boundaries, and his fundamental understanding of what made rock and roll more than just another musical fad. He was, in many ways, a musician's musician, someone who understood that the power of rock and roll lay not just in its ability to make teenagers dance, but in its potential to express the deepest yearnings of the human heart. But by 1959, cracks were beginning to show in the foundation of Eddie's success. The payola scandals had rocked the music industry, making radio programmers more cautious about promoting new rock and roll records. The death of Buddy Holly in February 1959 had shaken the entire community, a brutal reminder of how fragile life could be for young performers who spent their lives traveling from city to city, often in less than safe conditions. The tragedy struck without warning, but perhaps it shouldn't have been a surprise. On February 3rd, 1959, a small plane carrying Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and J.P. the Big Bopper Richardson crashed in an Iowa cornfield, killing all three musicians instantly. The news hit the rock and roll community like a physical blow. These weren't just colleagues, they were friends. Young men who had been living the same dangerous, exhilarating life that Eddie himself was living. Eddie's reaction to the crash was immediate and profound. Friends reported that he became obsessed with the details of the accident, poring over newspaper reports, trying to understand how three young men at the peak of their careers could simply vanish into the frozen Iowa landscape. The tragedy seemed to confirm his growing fears about the precarious nature of rock and roll success, the thin line between triumph and disaster that every performer walked every time they stepped on stage or climbed into a car or plane. The psychological impact of the day the music died extended far beyond simple grief. For Eddie, Buddy Holly's death represented a kind of preview of his own mortality, a reminder that fame offered no protection from the random cruelties of fate. He began to speak more frequently about death in his conversations with friends and family, not in a morbid way, but with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had glimpsed his own future and found it wanting. Sharon Sheely later recalled that Eddie's personality changed noticeably after Holly's death. The easy confidence that had carried him through his early success was replaced by a kind of nervous energy, a feeling that time was running out and there was still so much music left to make. He threw himself into his work with renewed intensity, spending long hours in the studio perfecting techniques that would later influence everyone from the Beatles to Led Zeppelin. Did this tragic event mark their downfall, or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems? The truth was probably more complex than anyone realized at the time. Eddie's growing preoccupation with mortality was certainly influenced by Holly's death, but it also reflected deeper anxieties about the sustainability of rock and roll as both an art form and a lifestyle. The music industry was changing rapidly as the 50s drew to a close. The raw energy that had characterized early rock and roll was being smoothed out, commercialized, made safe for mainstream consumption. Artists like Pat Boone were having hits with sanitized versions of songs originally recorded by black rhythm and blues artists, while the original rockers found themselves struggling to maintain relevance in an increasingly corporate environment. Eddie responded to these changes by doubling down on his commitment to artistic authenticity. If the industry wanted to water down rock and roll, he would make his music more powerful, more innovative, more uncompromisingly honest about the realities of young life in America. Songs like Something Else and Come On Everybody were defiant statements of rock and roll's continuing vitality. Proof that the music still had the power to move people in ways that the sanitized pop of the day simply couldn't match. But the commercial pressures were relentless. Record executives wanted hits, not artistic statements, and Eddie found himself constantly battling to maintain creative control over his music. The stress of these battles, combined with his growing anxiety about mortality and the future of rock and roll, began to take a visible toll on his health and emotional well-being. The internal changes that Eddie experienced during this period were reflected not just in his music, but in his relationships and his approach to life in general. Friends noticed that he had become more introspective, more philosophical about his place in the world. The cocky teenager who had burst onto the scene with Summertime Blues was evolving into a more complex artist, someone who understood that rock and roll was more than entertainment. It was a form of cultural expression that carried real responsibilities. Eddie's relationship with Sharon deepened during this period as both young people grappled with the challenges of maintaining authentic relationships in the artificial world of show business. Their love affair was conducted largely in public under the constant scrutiny of fans and reporters, but those close to them recognized it as a genuine connection between two people who understood each other's artistic struggles. The question that haunted Eddie during these months was whether he could continue to grow as an artist while maintaining his commercial viability. The music industry had a way of chewing up artists who became too demanding, too difficult, too unwilling to compromise their vision for the sake of radio play and record sales. Eddie had seen it happen to others, and he was determined not to let it happen to him. But determination alone wasn't enough to overcome the structural problems that plagued rock and roll in the late 50s. The payola scandals had made radio stations more conservative in their programming choices. Television variety shows were moving away from rock and roll toward more mainstream entertainment. Even the venues where rock and rollers could perform live were becoming scarce, as moral crusaders convinced venue owners that rock and roll was a corrupting influence on American youth. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? For Eddie, the shadow cast by Buddy Holly's death seemed to grow longer with each passing month. He began to talk openly about his own mortality, not in a self-pitying way, but with the kind of acceptance that comes from facing an uncomfortable truth. The rock and roll lifestyle was dangerous. The constant travel, the pressure, the temptations that surrounded young performers who suddenly found themselves with money and freedom, but little guidance on how to handle either. Eddie's response to these realizations was characteristically practical. If his time might be limited, he would make the most of it. He threw himself into his music with renewed intensity, experimenting with new sounds and techniques that would influence rock music for decades to come. The multi-tracking and overdubbing techniques he pioneered in songs like Summertime Blues were years ahead of their time, anticipating developments that wouldn't become standard industry practice until the mid-60s. But even as his artistic vision expanded, Eddie found himself increasingly isolated from his peers. The rock and roll community that had seemed so vital just a few years earlier was fragmenting. Some artists were adapting to the changing commercial landscape by softening their sound and their image. Others were burning out under the pressure, falling victim to the very excesses that moral crusaders warned against. Eddie seemed determined to find a third path, one that would allow him to maintain his artistic integrity while continuing to reach the teenage audience that had first embraced his music. The solution, he decided, lay in expanding his reach beyond America. British teenagers had embraced rock and roll with an enthusiasm that rivaled their American counterparts, and the British music scene offered opportunities for artistic growth that were becoming increasingly rare in the United States. A tour of England in early 1960 seemed like the perfect opportunity to reinvent himself as an international artist, to prove that rock and roll could transcend national boundaries and cultural differences. The decision to tour England would prove fateful, but at the time it seemed like exactly the kind of bold move that Eddie's career needed. He was still only 21 years old, still full of the energy and ambition that had carried him from small-town Minnesota to international stardom. The future seemed full of possibilities, new sounds to explore, new audiences to conquer, new ways to push the boundaries of what rock and roll could be and do. But fate, as Eddie was about to discover, had other plans for the young man who had promised to take rock and roll to heaven in just 3 steps. The tour of England in early 1960 was supposed to be Eddie's triumphant return to the international stage, a chance to reconnect with the pure energy of rock and roll performance after months of studio work and industry politics back in America. British teenagers had embraced rock and roll with a fervor that impressed even veteran American performers, and Eddie looked forward to playing for audiences who understood instinctively what his music was trying to say. The performances were everything Eddie had hoped they would be. Night after night, he stood before crowds of screaming teenagers who sang along to every word of Summertime Blues and Come On Everybody, their enthusiasm reminding him why he had fallen in love with rock and roll in the first place. The British press, more sophisticated in their coverage of popular music than their American counterparts, recognized Eddie as a serious artist, not just another teen idol. But beneath the surface excitement of the tour, Eddie's friends noticed that he seemed different. The anxiety that had plagued him since Buddy Holly's death had not diminished. If anything, it seemed to have intensified. He spoke frequently about death, about the feeling that his time was somehow running out, that he needed to accomplish everything he could before it was too late. Sharon Sheely, who accompanied him on the tour, later recalled that Eddie had become almost obsessive about his work during this period. He would spend hours in his hotel room working on new songs, trying out different chord progressions, recording snippets of melodies on a small tape recorder he carried everywhere. It was as if he was trying to capture lightning in a bottle, to create something permanent and lasting before the moment passed. The irony was not lost on those who knew him well. Eddie had achieved everything he had dreamed of as a young musician, but success had brought with it a kind of existential anxiety that made it difficult for him to enjoy his accomplishments. The boy who had once played guitar simply for the joy of making music had become a young man burdened by the knowledge that his talent carried responsibilities to his fans, to his art, to the future of rock and roll itself. Were these final decisions acts of surrender or courageous acts of self-preservation? The question would haunt those who knew Eddie in the weeks leading up to the tour's end. Some saw his introspection as evidence of growing maturity, the natural evolution of a young artist coming to terms with his place in the world. Others worried that the pressures of fame and the trauma of Holly's death had affected him more profoundly than anyone realized. The final performance of the tour at the Hippodrome in Bristol on April 16, 1960, was by all accounts a triumph. Eddie seemed to have recaptured some of his old energy, his connection with the audience as electric as it had ever been. He played with a passion and intensity that reminded everyone why he was considered one of rock and roll's most gifted performers. His voice soaring over the screams of teenage fans who seemed to understand that they were witnessing something special. But even as Eddie basked in the applause that night, he was already focused on the next phase of his career. He had been talking for months about returning to America to work on a new album, one that would push the boundaries of rock and roll even further. He had ideas for songs that would incorporate elements of rhythm and blues, country music, and even classical techniques he had been studying. The future seemed full of possibilities. The decision to drive through the night to London rather than wait until morning was made for purely practical reasons. Eddie was eager to catch the first available flight back to Los Angeles, where studio time had been booked and songs were waiting to be recorded. The faster they reached London, the sooner he could get back to the work that had become his obsession. The rain that began falling as they left Bristol was heavy but not unusual for April in England. The roads were slick but not impassable, and their driver, George Martin, was experienced and careful. There was no reason to suspect that this journey would be different from the hundreds of others that Eddie had taken during his years of constant touring. As the Ford Consul made its way through the darkness toward London, Eddie sat in the back seat with Sharon, talking quietly about their plans for the future. Gene Vincent in the front seat dozed fitfully, his injured legs stretched awkwardly in the cramped space. The conversation was relaxed, even optimistic. Three young Americans heading home after a successful tour, their minds already focused on the work that awaited them. But at 11:50 p.m., as the car approached a sharp curve near Chippenham, everything changed in an instant. The wet roads, the speed, the fatigue that comes from weeks of constant travel, all of these factors conspired to create the perfect conditions for disaster. The car skidded, struck a lamppost, and came to rest in a tangle of metal and broken glass that would forever change the landscape of rock and roll. Eddie Cochran died at St. Martin's Hospital in Bath on Easter Sunday, April 17, 1960, just hours after the crash. He was 21 years old, the same age as Buddy Holly had been when he died 14 months earlier. The official cause of death was listed as severe brain trauma. But for those who knew Eddie well, the real cause went much deeper than the physical injuries he sustained in the crash. The news of Eddie's death spread quickly around the world, carried by wire services and radio stations that interrupted regular programming to announce the passing of one of rock and roll's brightest stars. The reaction was immediate and intense. Teenagers who had grown up with Eddie's music mourned as if they had lost a close friend, while fellow musicians struggled to comprehend the loss of someone who had been, in many ways, just hitting his creative stride. The funeral, held in Glendale, California, drew thousands of mourners, many of them teenagers who had never met Eddie but felt connected to him through his music. The service was a strange mixture of grief and celebration, a testament to the power of rock and roll to create genuine emotional bonds between performers and their audiences. But even as the world mourned Eddie Cochran's passing, questions began to emerge about the circumstances of his death. The crash had occurred on a straight stretch of road under conditions that, while challenging, should not have been impossible for an experienced driver to navigate. Some wondered whether the pressures of the music industry, the constant touring, the relentless demands placed on young performers, had contributed to a tragedy that might have been prevented. Was their death as straightforward as reported, or were powerful hidden forces involved? The questions were not entirely paranoid speculation. The music industry of the late 50s and early 60s was a complex web of competing interests. Record labels, booking agents, radio programmers, venue owners, all of whom had financial stakes in the careers of young performers. When conflicts arose, the resolution was not always gentle or fair. Eddie had been involved in several disputes with industry figures in the months leading up to his death. Disagreements about creative control, touring schedules, and the direction of his career. Some close to him believed that these conflicts had created stresses that contributed to his deteriorating mental state and ultimately to the poor decision-making that led to the fatal drive through the English countryside. The investigation into the crash was thorough but ultimately inconclusive. The official finding of accidental death satisfied legal requirements, but it did little to ease the minds of those who felt that Eddie's death was symptomatic of larger problems within the rock and roll industry. The constant pressure, the isolation, the dangerous lifestyle that fame required, all of these factors had created conditions that made tragedy almost inevitable. In the months and years that followed Eddie's death, his influence on popular music became increasingly apparent. The techniques he had pioneered in the recording studio were adopted and refined by a new generation of musicians who understood that rock and roll was more than just entertainment. It was an art form with unlimited potential for growth and development. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, The Who, Led Zeppelin, and countless other bands would build on the foundation that Eddie and his contemporaries had laid in the studios of the late 50s. But perhaps Eddie's most important legacy was not technical but spiritual. His music had captured something essential about the experience of being young in mid-20th century America: the restlessness, the rebellion against authority, the desperate desire to break free from the suffocating expectations of adult society. These themes would resonate through the decades, providing the emotional foundation for the social and cultural revolutions that transformed the Western world in the 1960s and beyond. Eddie Cochran's name appears in the lyrics of punk rock songs, in the liner notes of classic rock albums, in the acknowledgments of books about the history of popular music. He is remembered not just as a talented performer, but as one of the founding fathers of a musical revolution that changed the world. The boy from Albert Lee, Minnesota, who dreamed of making lightning with his guitar, had succeeded beyond his wildest imagination. And the lightning he created continues to illuminate new generations of musicians and music lovers. The eternal question remains: what might Eddie Cochran have accomplished if he had lived? The songs he left behind suggest an artist who was just beginning to explore his full potential. Someone who understood that rock and roll was capable of expressing the full range of human emotion and experience. His death at 21 robbed the world of decades of music that might have pushed the boundaries of popular culture in ways we can only imagine, but perhaps that is exactly the point. Eddie Cochran's legacy lies not just in the music he made, but in the possibilities he represented, the proof that a working-class kid with talent, determination, and vision could reach across cultural and geographical boundaries to touch the hearts of millions. He showed that rock and roll was more than a fad or a commercial enterprise. It was a new form of artistic expression that could carry the deepest truths about human experience. In the end, Eddie Cochran's story is both a triumph and a tragedy, a reminder that genius often burns bright and brief, but that its light can illuminate the world long after the flame has been extinguished. The boy who sang about taking 3 steps to heaven may have completed that journey sooner than anyone expected. But the path he blazed continues to guide new generations of dreamers who understand that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that end too soon, leaving the rest of us to wonder what might have been while celebrating what was.